Introduction. In every society, you will find the dualism of man and his works. There is no good without evil, no civilization without barbarism, no life without death. The inevitable progression of humanity from primitive culture to advanced techno-society is in fact but half the truth, for the forces that would tear down these bastions of progress are no less inevitable. In the end, history is not so much a chronicle of years as it is a story of cycles. Perhaps the ancients recognized this best with their stories of Armageddon, Ragnarok, and nuclear holocaust, but they reckoned without the turn of the wheel that will start the whole cycle over once more. Dr. Ernst Mayr, Shadows of the Future, Commonwealth Publications, Terra, 3024. The Federated Suns is one of the largest and most powerful of the successor states. Along with the Draconis Combine, it stands as a dominant influence in the politics and military strategies of the 31st century. Indeed, few objective observers dispute the fact that these two interstellar states are most likely of all the successor powers to achieve the elusive goal of reunification of the inner sphere, which has been at the root of the seemingly endless wars of the modern era. The Federated Suns is the largest alliance in the inner sphere, comprising over 500 inhabited star systems spread out over some 20,000 square parsecs of space, and it is this size that gives House Davion preeminence in human-occupied space. Beginning as a loose association of 20 worlds just over 700 years ago, it has been one of the most stable of the political bodies in explored space. Although occasionally plagued by internal disruptions, and often heavily involved in wars with its two neighboring states, the Draconis Combine and the Capellan Confederation, the Federated Suns has managed to grow and prosper through most of its long and eventful history. Yet, no other successor state has been as badly hurt by the loss of technology during the succession wars. In some ways, its economic condition might be summed up as a few overdeveloped worlds in an underdeveloped realm. The Davion government has, therefore, placed a high priority on scientific research, which may spell trouble for Commonwealth in the future. Of all the successor states, the Federated Suns makes the most of keeping alive the principles of democracy and promoting the cause of personal freedoms, and takes a highly pragmatic view of the matter. Prince Hanse Davion, the current House leader, believes that whether a government is free or totalitarian, it must spend about the same amount of energy to maintain order, either by taking pains to protect its citizens' rights or by creating agencies to suppress those rights. Prince Davion reasons that there is more to be gained in loyalty and patriotism by protecting the people's rights than by oppressing them. However, the Draconis Combine is no more evil because it is generally perceived as a brutal, repressive police state than the Federated Suns' image automatically makes it good. Like all human endeavors, the Federated Suns has its strengths and weaknesses, and owes much of what it is now to the political and social evolution that is history in action. Though outward appearances may suggest that the Federated Suns is a champion of democratic freedoms, the realities are not so simple. Like the other interstellar states that have survived the chaos of post-League War and the continuing devolution of social and economic order, the Federated Suns has been forced to adopt expediencies rather than cling to idealism. If democracy ever was the ideal of the Federated Suns, and there are those that would dispute this, it certainly has been forced to give way in the harsh light of necessity. Led by a warrior aristocracy, locked in constant wars over territory, this realm would not appear much different than other states to an unbiased observer. The fact that idealism once counted for so much and still forms the mainstay of the government's propaganda effort may be more damning than any other fact. In looking back at Federated Suns history, however, starting even before the Crusade Pact that marked the political beginnings of that realm, it is hard to see how it could have developed differently, given all the factors that shaped man's patterns in the third millennium. The Federated Suns grew from the vision of a single man, Lucien Davion, whose Crucis Pact was one of the earliest and most successful interstellar unions forged in the wake of the collapse of the Terran Alliance. The Crucis Pact, though, was the development of one statesman's hopes for a better future. A scion of the unique society of New Avalon, Hanse Davion brought to his vision the traditions of his family, his planet, and his life. And the Federated Suns that grew out of the Crucis Pact reflected the essence of these traditions, a mixture of independence and authoritarianism, democracy and aristocracy, soaring aspirations and practical, sometimes even paranoid fears. The history of the state is the story of all these elements writ large against the background of human civilization, and like the author of that first pact, the Federated Suns has passed through hope to ambition to the edge of collapse and back again. What the future holds for the Federated Suns depends on its recent alliance with House Steiner's Lyran Commonwealth, whose economic power is a perfect complement to Davion's military might. Though some believe that this alliance may be the first step toward reunification of the inner sphere, or at least the establishment of a new Star League, it is far too early to tell. The biggest obstacle is that the other three powers of the inner sphere banded together in an alliance of their own almost before the ink was dry on the Steiner-Davion Pact. No one text can hope to cover the whole intricate tangle of military, political, economical, and social factors that have shaped the Federated Suns over the course of some 700 years. Only the most significant forces, the crucial causes and effects, can be analyzed here. In the history of the House of Davion, New Avalon, and the Federated Suns, we can see vividly the influences that have been at work in all of the successor states through the centuries, and from them recognize the turn of the wheel as it comes around once again in our times and beyond. On a personal note, I would like to thank ComStar director Julian Theopolo for entrusting me with this project. Not only was it a great personal honor to serve ComStar and Truth in this way, but it also gave me the opportunity to research the factual history of my purported ancestor, Stefan Amaris. Anastasia Marcus, Historical Director, Davion Research Project, ComStar Archives, Terra, 3028. We must remember, too, that the 5 successor states, vast as they are only the largest powers of the modern galaxy. Those of us from the periphery are more than a little skeptical of the recorded history of the great houses of the inner sphere. Some of it has been lost to the destruction of the succession wars that have dominated our race for almost 3 centuries. Some of it is purely self-serving. With ComStar's access to the best and most extensive source materials available, our blessed orders researchers have unearthed the truth about House Davion if anyone could. Where contradictions appeared, I have attempted to resolve them as sensibly as possible. Where that was not possible, I have decided to include equally plausible versions of the same story so that the reader can judge for himself. History. Introduction. It took humankind some 200 years to evolve from a relatively primitive, planet-bound race to a spacefaring empire of over 1,000 colony worlds. The greatest irony of the succession wars is that, in a mere 2 centuries of warfare, the human sphere has taken enormous strides backward instead of forward. The roots of the 5 successor states and dozens of periphery states go back to primitive rocketry experiments during World War II in the 1940s. In the following decades, 2 victors of that war, the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, competed to see who could explore outer space more quickly. Though these early space probes only carried explorers about 100 miles into Terran orbit, these tentative efforts would one day lead to full-scale colonization. Editor's note: it has also been remarked that the end of Terra's feasibility as home for the entire human race began when the names of nations got longer and longer. At that time, there was even a country called the People's Democratic Republic of South Yemen, but ComStar researchers have been unable to find its location on any ancient map of Terra. In the 21st century, political alignments on the Terran homeworld began to shift drastically. After the Second Soviet Civil War 2011–2014, the Western Alliance, America and Europe became the preeminent world power. The Western Alliance's highest priority was peaceful scientific research and development to overcome disease, hunger, overpopulation, and environmental damage. Meanwhile, in 2018, one of the greatest scientific breakthroughs of the ages occurred when two theoretical physicists named Takayoshi Fuchida and Thomas Kearney found a slight anomaly in the work on prototype fusion reactors. Extrapolating from this, they postulated that it was possible for mass, in short bursts, to exceed the speed of light. Fellow scientists ridiculed Kearney and Fuchida's work, and drove them from the profession. As a result, their groundbreaking discovery would remain forgotten for almost a century. Meanwhile, other scientific breakthroughs such as asteroidal mining, recombinant DNA organisms, and free-floating space factories which permitted industrial procedures impossible in an atmosphere or under gravity ensured a standard of living higher than ever before. Without enough food to feed people on the ground, however, famines became increasingly widespread among the world's population. Editor's note: indeed, the most famous artwork of the 21st century may well be Alexandra Mcom's Threnody, a portrait of a child dying of hunger as she watches an early her love-eyed. It is greatly to be regretted that so much technology, even of the 21st century, has been lost in the succession wars. A great leap. By 2050, Alliance scientists were using the first fusion drive, developed 24 years earlier, to spearhead the Magellan program. Under the auspices of this project, automated probes were sent to dozens of neighboring star systems to seek out habitable worlds. The probes discovered 3 such planets in the Tau-Ceti, Epsilon Eridani, and Epsilon Indi systems. In retrospect, this event dwarfs even the most important political event of that era, the replacement of the old Western Alliance with the Terran Alliance, in 2086. In 2102, 2 separate teams of research physicists surprised the world by simultaneously announcing their findings that Kearney and Fuchida had been right. It was theoretically possible to transport mass instantaneously to a spot several light-years away if a sufficient energy field could be generated to do so. The new research led to the Demos project, whose goal was to develop a working faster-than-light FTL hyperpulse drive. The project was a success, and by 2108, the Terran Alliance had succeeded in launching the TAS Pathfinder, the first manned interstellar vessel using the Kearney-Fuchida FTL drive. The Pathfinder's maiden voyage to Tau-Ceti allowed scientists to survey the planet for future colonization. A mere 8 years later, the first human colony in space was officially established on New Earth Tau-Ceti IV in 2116. Settling the stars. The great adventure had begun, as more and more FTL ships took colonists to new homes on new worlds. The Grand Survey of 2172 reported more than 100 human colonies spread across a sphere 80 light-years in diameter. By 2235, the fourth survey showed the settlement of more than 600 worlds. In these years of expansion into the galaxy, the major political parties on Terra were known as the expansionist and liberal parties. Their debate centered on whether it best served humanity to tap the economic possibilities of space travel and colonization, or whether the government should first solve the pressing problems of poverty and hunger on the home world. It was this conflict that would one day erupt into a tragic civil war and the total collapse of the Terran Alliance government. Editor's note: this intense expansion almost stopped dead after the collapse of the Terran Alliance in 2314. Perhaps the lack of a single home base nullified the need to found further colonies. Despite the changing political fortunes and loyalties among the planets of the inner sphere, the size of the explored galaxy has remained largely unchanged for nearly 7 centuries. Perhaps there are epochs in history when humanity finds an area large enough to grow into first a country, then a continent, then a world, then 4,000 worlds, and remains at that level of expansion until it, too, has been outgrown. We may be on the verge of a new outreach within the next century, judging by the intensity of the demand by certain elements of the Federated Suns government for a deeper exploration into the periphery. World of hope, world of sorrow. Trusting divine providence to be our guide. We, the sovereign citizens of New Avalon, do this day ordain and approve this covenant. That all peoples upon the face of this planet shall be forever equal under the law, that justice shall rule the strong as it does the weak, that freedom shall be our sword and hope our strongest shield. From the Covenant of New Avalon, 2239. Founding of New Avalon. New Avalon, a garden planet in the heart of the Crucice Reach, was surveyed in the first decade of the 23rd century. As the world was lush and did not have to import water via ice ships, it did not take long for 3 successive waves of colonists to settle the region in the years from 2213 to 2221. Accompanying the first colonists were the usual trappings of Terran power: 3 regiments of colonial marines, a governor-general with full administrative entourage, and a long list of Terran-formulated laws, regulations, and quotas. Colonists searching for the oft-advertised new freedom of new worlds quickly experienced the familiar restrictive control prevalent on Terra. Perhaps it was that the mother planet of man, with its dwindling resources, expanding population, and antiquated governments, really did need such restrictions to survive. Out in the unspoiled frontier of space, however, terrestrial ways were sadly inadequate to solve extraterrestrial problems. The colonists of New Avalon had been selected by quota from volunteers in various Western European nations, with Scotland, Ireland, England, Germany, and Pan-Scandinavia contributing the largest percentage. In the first 15 years, 8 cities were established on 3 continents, with hundreds of farming communities scattered throughout the vast, fertile farmlands. By 2231, several governor-generals had come and gone on New Avalon. In that fateful year, Alliance Fleet Rear Admiral Emil Varney arrived to take charge of planetary affairs. Varney was the alleged villain of the Smolensk incident, in which colonial marines fired upon a crowd of protesters during a drought. He was not the monster that later generations would remember, however, but merely an unimaginative, inflexible military man trying to do his duty. Is he to blame for the unfeeling orders issued to him by masters too many light years away? The Grain Rebellion. New Avalon was now one of the 1,000 human colonies that flourished across a sphere 500 light years in diameter. With each expansion of the human sphere, the time it took for messages to travel to and from Terra to its colonies increased. Indeed, it now took a full 8 months for communications to reach the most distant human outpost. It is not surprising that the resourceful, independent breed of human colonists should eventually want independence from the distant rulers of Terra. In 2236, a coalition of colonies along the outer reaches of known space declared their independence. During the next 18 months, the Terran Alliance fought to hold on to her far-flung colonies, but it was a losing battle. Varney's folly. Few leaders in history have managed as well as Emil Varney to take the wrong stand at the wrong time. Painted as the sadist of Smolensk by some, Varney will probably always be a figure of controversy. Could he really have been the beast that historians claim, or was he simply the victim of circumstance and political manipulation? Very likely, he was just a rigid disciplinarian too immured in military ways to realize that mere obedience to orders is not always enough. The Smolensk incident was certainly a tragic waste of life, but few modern histories mention that Varney, as military commander on Smolensk, was subject to the orders of Alliance Colonial Office Representative Haneke at the time. We need only look at the verdict of the court, However, to see that Varney was reprimanded and put on half pay for excessive use of force, though charges of willful murder were dropped. Mech committed suicide on Smolensk, and so his side of the story will never be known. As for Varney, his appointment as Governor-General on New Avalon must have been a last chance. Caught between an unreasonable colonial office, a mob of protesters, and the memory of past misdeeds, is it any wonder that he froze? Fast, conciliatory action might have headed off an ugly incident and allowed the old spacer to die among family and friends with his honor intact. But Varney was not capable of such action, and the retreat of Terran Marines from New Avalon would have happened with or without Emil Varney. It must have been painful for him when his eldest son defected to the New Avalon rebels, or when the expansionists and isolationists heaped scorn on him in his later years. The character that Chartiers and Geruda created for their trilogy on the end of the colonial era, Three Faces of Empire, 2658, was not really Emil Varney. His failure was never the stuff of, might have been only the basis for Holosho's and vid tapes about a monster who never really lived. From Tumultuous Times, by Raido Oispan, Mujan Press, 2983. In 2237, with Terran military forces already trying to put down uprisings in the colonies, the Alliance Parliament ordered its loyal worlds to increase their production quotas to cover losses due to the colonial rebellion. The teeming billions of Terra continued to need food and raw materials, and could only look to their colonies to supply them. The Terran leaders found it convenient to overlook the fact that most of the colonies were themselves already stretched to the limit. On New Avalon, demonstrators protested against the new work quotas by tearing down the pronouncements from their posting places and burning them publicly. With winter coming on after a poor harvest season, the colony needed its food stores simply to survive. Though it was clearly impossible to meet the new quotas, Varney chose to obey his orders rather than listen to his advisors. Armed Marines rounded up the quota shipments and then escorted them to the spaceport, where they were to be loaded aboard Terra-bound freighters. Those freighters would never arrive home, however. The angry colonials stormed the port that night, taking heavy casualties before they seized the ships, unloaded the shipments, and then sabotaged the vessels beyond hope of repairing New Avalon's poor facilities. The Grain Rebellion is still commemorated on New Avalon each year. Governor-General Varney found himself in an untenable position, unable to meet his quota and unable to get assistance from the Alliance. Deserted by most of his Marines who sympathized with the colonial position and even by members of his own family, Varney and a handful of senior staff personnel fled New Avalon. The colonial vice-governor surrendered the residency peacefully to protesters when it became clear that the colonists were ready to starve out the staff. Varney reached Terra, but by the time he presented his case to the Alliance Colonial Office, political upheavals were already toppling the expansionist party. No relief expedition was dispatched to New Avalon. The leaders of the isolationists chose to retire Emil Varney from public life and to sweep the whole unfortunate incident under the rug of colonial readjustments. Grain Rebellion Day. In 2740, I journeyed to New Avalon to observe the natives on their Grain Rebellion Day. Avalon City was aglow all day and all night, partly from the beautiful weather and roseate street lighting and partly from the spirit in the air. Beginning late in the morning, there is a 4-hour reenactment of the Grain Rebellion itself. People don colorful period costumes and play the roles of their ancestors storming the spaceport, which has no scheduled traffic for 12 hours in deference to the ritual. Many of the adults taking part will fall to the ground as if they have been shot, only to jump up and continue the charge seconds later, like children playing rangers and bandits. In early afternoon, the spaceport is captured, grain is distributed from a dummy ship, and the second phase of the celebration begins. The solemn portion of the holiday begins when the politicians and priests take over. There are speeches, followed by an ecumenical religious observance in honor of the souls of those who died in the rebellion. As night is coming on, the festivities begin again. People return to their homes, banquet halls, or churches to hold the biggest feast of the year in memory of how the rebellion kept the people of New Avalon from starving. After that, there is a wild, planet-wide party reminiscent of the ancient Terran tradition of Mardi Gras. Dressed in bizarre costumes that range from the sinister to the sexy, the people dance in the streets all night. All this reflects the Davion people's devotion to their history, but it also reveals how their decadent foolishness defiles the memory of their ancestors' profound sacrifices. The ritual does not celebrate the primeval mystery of the renewal of the seasons or the triumph over atavistic or occult dangers. The poor fools think that all they are doing is having a good time. From Celebration of the Slave Goddess, an anthropological approach to holidays, by Waitakam Sando, Kaplia University Press, 2759. Brave new government. Is this why we fought the governor for the right to destroy ourselves? Colonel Jason Haysk, 2249. As it became obvious that the leaders of the Terran Alliance lacked the military resources and the popular support to crush the colonial rebellion, a new political crisis erupted. When the expansionist party toppled from power in favor of the more isolationist Liberal Party, the new leaders ordered that both troops and assistance be withdrawn from their former colony worlds. Whether they liked it or not, the colonists now had their precious freedom. Meanwhile, the Terran Alliance gradually withdrew its boundaries to a single 30-year FTL jump from home. Like many other colony worlds, the inhabitants of New Avalon had been expecting a full-fledged war of independence that never came. Instead, they found themselves cut off from both the power and the aid of the mother planet. Seeing that they must now govern themselves, the Avalonians established a provincial government under the leadership of Colonel Jason Haysk, a militia leader who had distinguished himself in the Grain Rebellion. Haysk called for a constitutional convention, with delegates elected by the colony. This ad hoc Congress drafted the Covenant of New Avalon, which was ratified by a general vote in 2239. Full of high ideals and a sweeping condemnation of Terran tyranny, the Covenant also became the preamble to a constitution that provided a democratic form of government for New Avalon. A prime minister, a judiciary committee, and a Chamber of Deputies were established as the main arms of the new government, with the populace at large deciding all issues through computer voting. It was a government that might have suited an advanced and totally self-sufficient world. For a comparatively young colony like New Avalon, the system was doomed to fail. In 2239, Jason Haysk was voted the colony's first prime minister by an overwhelming majority. The colony functioned fairly well during his one-year term, mostly because the populace was willing to sacrifice for the common good. 9 successive prime ministers took office after Haysk, who retired to a peaceful farmer's life while retaining the honorary post of Colonel General of the Planetary Militia. By 2249, as the 10th annual planetary elections drew near, the flaws in the administrative apparatus were beginning to show. New Avalon might boast of its independence, but the colony's agricultural base was insufficient to the needs of the people. Further, the necessity of submitting all issues to a general democratic vote was a stumbling block to progress. Poorly informed or easily misled citizens usually outnumbered those capable of making rational judgments and of accepting short-term hardship for long-term achievements. Though rapid industrialization was desperately needed, the prohibition against a prime minister serving more than one successive term in office kept New Avalon's leaders from being able to implement a forward-looking policy in any area. Jason Haysk, The New Cincinnatus. In Shadows of the Future, Ernst Mayr wrote that, every culture must have its folk heroes, whether those heroes are real or not. The career of Jason Haysk of New Avalon is a case in point. It is unlikely that Haysk possessed any true statesmanship. A colonel in the ad hoc militia formed during the rebellion against the Terran Alliance, he held his rank on the basis of popularity rather than talent. What he lacked in tactical skill, however, Hanse made up for with bravery, leading his men in a daring attack on the control tower at Avalon Landing. Luckily for Hanse, the defenders were unprepared. Otherwise, New Avalon's first hero might have received his honors posthumously. As it was, Jason Hanse, like Napoleon at the Bridge of Lodi, earned a reputation for courage and fighting skill that made him the darling of the rebel cause. Thus was he propelled into the limelight and into public life. The record of Hanse's political career reveals that he was a disastrous choice for high office. It was Hanse's failure to understand just where the new constitution was leading that sowed the seeds for later civil war. Strong leadership was called for in those early days, but Hanse appeared willing to accept the prime ministry as a reward for faithful service rather than as a responsibility for the future. It was only in his last days, with New Avalon nearly crumbling around him, that Jason Hanse finally seemed to understand. By then, however, it was too late. From Political Frauds, by Andrew Huexter, My Flying Gauze Publishing, 2659. The Power of Advertising. In 2253, Lundgram, the second largest town on New Avalon, was holding municipal elections. The front-runners for mayor were two men named Boyce and Janovic. Also on the ballot were several other lesser-known candidates and 3 or 4 more writing campaigns, all in a town of about 5,000 people. There were no residency requirements to run for office because people tended to move back and forth between the handful of early settlements on New Avalon. One of the newer residents of Lundgram was an entrepreneur named Louis Smytheson, who had just arrived to open a branch of his firm, Smytheson Fertilizer. As the political campaign heated up, Smytheson had a public relations brainstorm that would have planetary repercussions. Smytheson hung a sign outside his office window that blended right in with the political banners in the main town square. The sign read, "For good city government, vote for whomever you like. For crop yields of 10 to 40% higher per acre, vote for Louis Smytheson." Most of the people of New Avalon were second and third generation pioneers who had never seen a modern advertising campaign. Needless to say, Smytheson won the election on write-in ballots. Janovic, Boyce, and a couple of other candidates disputed the election, petitioning that an undeclared candidate could not be allowed to take office. Smytheson, who had no political ambitions, supported their suit, and he suggested that Boyce, the number 2 vote-getter, be declared the winner. The judge's decision was completely unexpected. He not only declared Smytheson the winner of the election, but proclaimed that if he did not serve his term of office, he would be liable to prosecution for defrauding the public trust. Though the mayor's job was part-time, Smytheson's fertilizer business suffered both from his neglect and the suspicion of the townspeople. Ultimately, Smytheson Fertilizer went bankrupt, Janovic retired from public life, and Boyce succeeded Smytheson as mayor of Lundgram. The town began to flourish under Boyce's guidance, but fell into decline once again when a competing settlement lured most of the population away to new jobs. As Avalon City continued to grow, it eventually annexed Lundgram, which is now one of the oldest and most prestigious neighborhoods in the capital. From Democratic Exigencies, Experiments in Government During the Exodus, by Marty Fear, Federated Press, 2589. Rise of Neo-Feudalism. Compounding the problem was the rise of Neo-Feudalism across the planet. The few centers of industry that did exist on New Avalon generated vast personal fortunes for their owners. In one decade, a handful of industrialists had built huge power bases. Economic power translated into political power, for the common citizen tended to vote for candidates who had the power to put bread on the table and tools in their hands. By 2248, most of these industrial aristocrats had formed their own private armies to further their ambitions and as protection against rivals. As the 10th annual planetary elections drew near, Sporadic violence and civil unrest broke out, but the planet's central government was too weak to put it down. 3 months prior to the scheduled Independence Day elections, Jason Hayes mustered the planetary militia to impose martial law and to bring the more aggressive power groups to heel. In a clash at the estate of the Jorgensen family, the Jorgensen retainers routed the militia and killed Jason Hayes. Almost on signal, there followed a complete breakdown of order, with each of the so-called first families making a separate bid for power. It was left to 2 surviving officers of the militia, Colonel Adam Davion and Colonel Nathan Duval, to save New Avalon from chaos and seemingly inevitable collapse. Both of these officers were themselves from powerful first families, but each knew that if the feudalistic rivalry continued, it would spell doom for their world. Backed by their own militias, Davion and Duval set out to unite supporters from their families so that they could negotiate from a position of strength. Shedrin's Neo-Feudalism. The idea behind Shedrin's theory is that previous economic systems have failed for one of 2 reasons, always related to population movement. A system in which vast numbers of the population were mobile could never become stable enough to develop its economic potential. With large population shifts, demographics become difficult, if not impossible, to determine. Jobs in one part of an economic area go begging while people in another area do the same, and neither wages nor taxes can be fairly apportioned. At the opposite extreme are governments that require people to remain in the same place indefinitely. In ancient times, this principle was known as having passed laws. The practice still exists throughout the Draconis Combine and the Capellan Confederation, and it was an economic disaster. Though an overly mobile society decreased stability, no mobility at all imposed such rigidity that the economy ground to a halt. Shedrin's solution was both simple and elegant. Through neo-feudalism, a government could assure its citizens' right to move around at will, while ensuring social stability through enormous tax incentives for families remaining in a particular locality. The system, in other words, combined the best aspects of capitalism and socialism. That is why Shedrin's theories will never die, and why they continue to offer us so much in the present age. From Neo-Feudalism, Ripple from the Past, Wave of the Future, by Lawrence Robert Head, Perspectives Press, 2832. Reformation. No government in history has ever balanced freedom with stability. You may create order or you may encourage freedom, but you shall never do both. Prime Minister Nathan Duval, in a letter written to his son, 2281. After 5 years of civil war and 2 years of uneasy negotiations, the crisis on New Avalon finally ended with the drafting of the Second Covenant of New Avalon. Though the document was an attempt to harken back to the spirit of the rebellion, it was a hollow effort. The Second Covenant and the resulting new constitution poorly disguised the fact that New Avalon's democratic experiment had failed. In its place was an oligarchy, with control vested in the hands of the first families. The new constitution strengthened New Avalon's central government. Where a prime minister had previously been elected for a 1-year term, he would now inhabit the office for life. Representatives of the first families, who sat on the Chamber of Deputies on behalf of the people who owed them fealty, selected the prime minister from among their number. The prime minister was given extensive powers, but the Chamber of Deputies could overrule him. Popular voting was a thing of the past. The new governmental apparatus was intended to provide greater stability to the administrative machinery of the government while keeping the first families happy. Life terms of office for prime ministers suppressed active political rivalries among the families, while permitting the chief executive to carry out long-term policies. It was not, perhaps, the ideal arrangement, but compared to the preceding 7 years of fear and strife, the new constitution might have been made in heaven. The first families extended services and economic support in return for the fealty of the masses. Though representatives to the Chamber of Deputies were not elected and could rarely be eclipsed, the arrangement did leave the oligarchy open-ended. As economic conditions on New Avalon stabilized and the first families lost their monopoly on essential functions, there will be room for fresh blood and liberal ideas. This aspect was an essential part of the plan formulated by Davion and Duval, but it was kept under wraps to avoid setting off reactionary elements jealous of personal power or influence. First Prime Ministers. The first Prime Minister elected under the new laws was Sandra Lockhart 2255 to 2261, an elderly compromise candidate selected more because she was not expected to live long than because of any particular qualifications. During her term of office, the government was concerned mostly with establishing itself as a viable, practical organ of society. Following her was Joseph Cartwright 2261 to 2280, who appointed Colonel Duval as Deputy Prime Minister, and then retired for most of his term to the secluded island of Eves. The Cartwright-Duval-Davion alliance was cemented during this era and quickly rose to dominate the Chamber of Deputies. They obtained their power by clever manipulation of new legislation aimed at sweeping improvements of the New Avalon economy. Duval, a political genius unsurpassed in the use of patronage and legal incentive, also worked behind the scenes to stimulate industry and off-world contacts. When Cartwright died in 2280, the 70-year-old Duval was himself elected to the Prime Ministry, despite his failing health. He was in office less than 2 years, but those years would have resounding repercussions on the government of New Avalon. This was mainly due to Duval's appointment of his son Martin to the same Deputy Prime Minister post that Colonel Duval had held under Cartwright. Martin Duval used this office to build up his own power base, which allowed him to step into his father's position when the elder Duval died in 2282. This marked the first time that the Prime Ministry had passed from one member of a first family to another of the same clan, and it set a precedent that would continue for over a century. Martin Duval's Prime Ministry was a period of rapid expansion, not just for New Avalon's burgeoning economy but also for the planet's space industry. The New Avalon had no shipbuilding industry and few repair facilities at the time of the Grain Rebellion. The colony had never totally lost contact with the rest of the human sphere. The handful of courier vessels and small left behind by Varne had managed to keep interstellar communications channels open, at least intermittently. By the time of the Second Covenant, age had taken its toll on the tiny Avalonian fleet, but shipbuilding was expanded under the Cartwright/Duval administrations. In 2293, Martin Duval dedicated the first home-built freighter, the Hanse Davion. Within the next 10 years, New Avalon's trading fleet grew quickly, reaching out to other worlds of the Crucis reach. Some of these, being more self-sufficient than New Avalon, could supply superior goods and higher technologies, while the less fortunate worlds were ideal markets for export goods. The rebirth of widespread trade in the Crucis region was the salvation of New Avalon. Never again would the planet be cut off, and never again would lack of resources lead to political crises at home. Few people on New Avalon understood how important was this development, or that it would forever change their society. Within 2 generations of the Second Covenant, it had become inevitable that the first families would one day have to surrender their claim to power. When Martin Duval died in an untimely hunting accident in 2309, Lucien Davion, Duval's nephew and the grandson of Colonel Adam Davion, was Deputy Prime Minister. Young Davion's accession to the post of Prime Minister might have been considered dynastic succession, except that the deputies regarded him as the most logical choice at the time. Indeed, the Davion family was heir to the Duval political legacy as well as quite powerful in their own right. If anything, Colonel Adam Davion was even more popular with the militia than was Nathan Duval. It was in this same era of New Avalon's earliest prime ministers that a whole new wave of colonists had begun to flee terror once more, seeking to escape the political chaos created by the ever-deepening rift between the isolationists and the expansionists. These newest voyagers to the stars were among Terra's best and brightest, and their departure ushered in the era now known as the Exodus. An opposing view. By all accounts, Edward Alice Shedrin was a good, modest man, who was kind to his family and never threw litter in the street. Unfortunately, he was a 19th century man in a 24th century galaxy. He never seems to have realized that his social ideas were out of date centuries before they were formulated. Shedrin's simple, elegant bunkum had to do with tying down workers for large portions of their working lives in order to increase social stability. Even though this helped maximize profits for management and profit sharing for labor, there are several factors that Shedrin did not take into consideration, and these make his beautiful theory collapse like a house of cards in a Czechman windstorm. One is the problem of incentive. The workers in a neo-feudal situation have no more potential for lateral mobility than they have for geographic mobility. They cannot change jobs. Their promotions are scheduled years in advance, and they know what they will be doing and where they will be doing it so far ahead of time that they are robbed of all adventure and all sense of economic possibility. They become not only lackluster producers, but also lackluster consumers. Another problem Shedrin does not address is that of new products and services. With the stable populations he envisioned, the creation of new business ventures, particularly new fields or new products, was risky. Under his plan, entire populations of consumers get so set in their ways that the laws of supply and demand apply only to the demand for what is familiar. Thus, neo-feudalism prevents any real economic growth. Shedrin's theories combine the worst of both mercantilism and communism. A facile approach to complex problems is very tempting, which explains why neo-feudalism keeps coming back every couple of generations or so. On the surface, the theory appears to solve the most basic problems of economic theory, but a deeper analysis shows why it must always fail. From Fallacies and Foo-for-a-Roar, by Hyman Rockwell, Perspectives Press, 2832. Debate on the Second Covenant. I tell you, gentlemen, I fear for our colony. We are told that there is no emotional bond so great as having labored and fought for one's native soil, but that is just terrain nonsense. There is no bond like having labored and fought for a land you have traveled dozens of light years just to approach. Those who, like myself, are immigrants to this world, know that I speak the truth. The provisions of the covenant will bankrupt those of us with anything to lose. They will lay our most basic liberties before a newly created class of tyrants, and they will plunge us into a civil war that will make the recent Terran conflict look tame. We must not let this new class of tyrants hold sway on our world, for if they do, only bloodshed can come of it. Brendan Nagy, alderman for the 5th Municipal District of Avalon City, in a speech to his constituents, 2282. Critics of the proposed covenant have warned that it will lead to loss of liberty or bloodshed, or both. With all due respect to well-meaning individuals, we think they haven't got a clue. The hard fact is that we have already had bloodshed, and we have also had to deal with tyranny. The covenant, whatever its flaws, is designed to stop a civil war while leaving our liberties intact. And, let's face it, we have had no liberties under the martial law imposed on New Avalon in recent years. The exigencies of military rule leave little room for human values. If we are to remain truly human, we must do away with martial law, and make sure that it never rears its ugly head again. The Second Covenant is not only our best chance to do so, it may be our last. From an editorial by Grant Sumner, Avalon City. Daily Dispatch, 2282. Debate on the Second Covenant. I tell you, gentlemen, I fear for our colony. We are told that there is no emotional bond so great as having labored and fought for one's native soil, but that is just terrain nonsense. There is no bond like having labored and fought for a land you have. I traveled dozens of light years just to approach. Those who, like myself, are immigrants to this world, know that I speak the truth. The provisions of the Covenant will bankrupt those of us with anything to lose. They will lay our most basic liberties before a newly created class of tyrants, and they will plunge us into a civil war that will make the recent Terran conflict look tame. We must not let this new class of tyrants hold sway on our world, for if they do, only bloodshed can come of it. Brendan Nagy, alderman for the 5th Municipal District of Avalon City, in a speech to his constituents, 2282. Critics of the proposed covenant have warned that it will lead to loss of liberty or bloodshed, or both. With all due respect to well-meaning individuals, we think they haven't got a clue. The hard fact is that we have already had bloodshed, and we have also had to deal with tyranny. The Covenant, whatever its flaws, is designed to stop a civil war while leaving our liberties intact. And, let's face it, we have had no liberties under the martial law imposed on New Avalon in recent years. The exigencies of military rule leave little room for human values. If we are to remain truly human, we must do away with martial law, and make sure that it never rears its ugly head again. The Second Covenant is not only our best chance to do so, it may be our last. From an editorial by Grant Sumner, Avalon City Daily Dispatch, 2282. Rise of House Davion. How do you make sweeping statements about a family with a 1,000-year history? No set of catchphrases can describe every individual in the Davion line accurately. Yet the Davons themselves have an old saying about their clan, one that echoes what was said of the Claudian emperors of ancient Rome. The Davons breed two kinds of children, the fair and the foul, but it's not always clear which is which. From History of the Davons, by Enrico Rosario, Nova Press, Interstellar, 3015. Origins. Only a family born to war could produce the soldier who has given us peace. From a speech given by King Charles Ill, 2014. The background of the Davion family before the settlement of New Avalon is obscure, but certain family traditions and fragmentary histories do suggest some of their origins. A 16th-century Frenchman, Jean-Baptiste Davion, was the first of the line to use a recognizable form of the family name. Family records claim that Davion was born in the village of Avion in Gascony, the bastard son of the Count de Foix. With a romanticism typical of the Davion family's long history, Davion supposedly turned his back on his father's noble birth, enlisted in the French army as a common soldier, and was selected to be among the bodyguard that accompanied Mary Stuart back to her homeland when she became Queen of Scots. Service in her defence was usually rewarded with lands in the border country of Scotland. Later Davons would claim to be of Scots rather than French blood. Other family traditions are equally romantic. The Davion family on Terra must have had a flair for embracing lost causes and other idealistic movements. As loyal subjects of the Stuart kings, the family was granted a patent of nobility by Charles I. Baron Davion is recorded as failing in battle at the head of a volunteer regiment led by Montrose in the Battle of Preston. His grandson fought under Dundee at Killiecrankie, and another Davion was at Sheriffmuir. The family titles passed to a cadet branch for their faithful allegiance to the Stuarts, and after the Rising in 1719, the titular head of the line, Charles Francis Davion, was exiled to Europe. A Davion also turns up in the Young Pretender's army at Culloden. Pardons issued in the latter part of the 18th century permitted the Davons to return home, but they did not regain their titles or lands. Most family stories pass over the next several generations except to assert that Davons did their share of military service in the 3 world wars. A strong tendency toward militarism seems to have been a part of Davion's psychology. One family saying dating back to this period claims that, like Achilles, the Davons were ever fated to short but glorious lives. The name of Brigadier Arthur Davion, hero of the Battle of Moscow in 2013, became especially important in the family annals. Created a baron in that same year, the brigadier was one of the first 5 officers selected to form the Alliance peacekeeping forces that were the direct ancestors of Terra's colonial marines. Lord Davion revived his old family coat of arms, that of a fox crouched above a blood-red shield bearing the motto, Audacity, Bravery, Destiny. House Davion retains this personal crest as opposed to the official star and sunburst of the Federated Suns to this day. It is as much for this as for his cunning that Hanse Davion has been nicknamed, the Fox, by friend and enemy alike. Destiny's child. We owe our freedom to the dedication of our patriots, to the determination of our citizens, and to the valor of our soldiers. But for the support and the bravery of all who have fought for our cause, none would have lived to see this day. From the inaugural speech of Prime Minister Jason Haske, Provisional Government, New Avalon, 2237. The Davion family served the Alliance well for 2 centuries. Its members fought in almost all the brush fire wars and peacekeeping actions on Terra during this era, and there were Davons in several of the most important expeditions to new planets. Thomas, the 5th Lord Davion and 2nd Fleet General of the Alliance Colonial Marines, was responsible for important reforms in the Alliance military structure during the 22nd century. 2 members of the family were admirals, and there were a dozen more who attained the ranks of regimental commander or ship captain. Captain Lord Robert Davion, of the 6th Colonial Marines, was the great-grandson of Fleet General Davion. He was an angular man with a ruddy complexion, grey hair, and bushy eyebrows. As a younger son, he was not in line to inherit the privileges or the duties of the barony, but his name helped advance his military career. He served as a staff officer on Terra until the death of his wife when he was 32. With a 7-year-old son in tow, Robert volunteered for duty on the frontier. His motivations will probably never be known, but such impulsiveness is typical of many Davons. Having used all his influence to obtain a post in a colony world, Lord Robert gathered up his son, his sister, and a young cousin just out of the Alliance Military Academy and travelled to New Avalon in 2232. There, he and his family would one day play a role that could only have been forged by destiny. A change of heart. Robert Davion quickly became attached to the beautiful world of New Avalon and to the bold, adventurous people who were settling here. Within a year of his arrival, he had met and fallen in love with Suzanne Marzine, heiress to the wealthy Marzines who controlled much of the iron and steel industry on the planet's north continent. As matters began to come to a head on New Avalon in 2237, the captain found himself in sympathy with the colonists rather than with the administrators. There are many tales of how Robert Davion came to side with the colonists, the most popular being the one about how he prevented some Marines from abusing a farmer and his family while trying to confiscate their produce. The plain truth, however, is that Davion's decision was cold and calculating. Shortly before the outbreak of the Grain Rebellion in 2237, Davion became acquainted with the Sons of New Avalon, the militant underground group responsible for most of the anti-Terran agitation on the planet. As a member of the colonial liaison staff, he staffed the first New Avalon colonial militia with some malcontents to give them access to marine weapons and equipment on the night before the raid on Avalon Landing. He also supplied information that the rebels needed to attack Avalon Landing and to cease the transports berthed there. Robert Davion deserted his post at the Residency 6 hours before the outbreak of the rebellion, and is believed to have acted as a military advisor to the rebels when they began the siege of the Residency. Davion to the rescue. Robert Davion's part in the Grain Rebellion is probably best seen in the incident that first brought him fame on his adoptive planet. It was a deed that might never have been noticed were this not a time when our patriotic sons of New Avalon felt little trust for off-worlders. Riding native Terran horses like the hussars of old, Davion and the brace of other young officers on patrol came upon a farm where the colonial tax collectors were harassing a poor farmer named Koliak. They had already confiscated Koliak's crops for export to Terra and were beating up the protesting Koliak when Davion and his men arrived. The chief tax collector called out to the three officers to join the fun. "I see you have a whip there, Captain," the villain called out, pointing to Davion's riding crop. "In the name of the rightful Terran government, one command you to thrash this fool and teach him a lesson about resisting our power." Davion said not a word, but sat nearly motionless in the saddle. The only sound was the restless stamping of the horse's feet. The tax collector repeated his order. Slowly, Davion dismounted, and the other two officers did the same. None of them bothered to tie their horses, which remained standing in perfect formation. Although Davion stood at least 6 inches shorter than the tax collector, he raised his crop and lashed him 3 times, once quickly across each cheek and a third time across the back of the head as the man ducked. No one else moved for a moment, because Davion's action was as surprising as it was dramatic. Then the tax collector's minions took to their heels, running away and leaving their horses for the officers and Koliak. During the entire encounter, Robert Davion never spoke a word. From Glory Days, Early Independence from Terra, by Justin Frederick Poulier, Davion Historical Press, 2820. Much nonsense has been written about Robert Davion's rebellion, during the real rebellion of 2237. Though his courage during that time is undisputed, the truth about his motives is somewhat murkier. Take, for example, his famous rescue of a New Avalonian grain farmer from the clutches of Terran marine tax collectors. He was riding with 2 ranking members of the Sons of New Avalon, who were sure to report the incident to their superiors and thus establish his credibility as a sympathizer with the group. Moreover, the act of provoking the colonial government at that point was sure to spark new rebellion elsewhere, which could only benefit Robert's political ambitions. More to the point, historians overlook the fact that Davion and his 2 confederates had ridden all day with inadequate provisions, trusting to the generosity of any farmers they might encounter on their patrol. Indeed, Mikhail Koliak treated them to a fine feast that day after the thrashing Robert Davion had given the tax collector. From Truth or History, Lies Our Forefathers Told Us, by Trudy Sims, Nes Press, 3021. Katherine and Davion, An Appreciation. Some have wondered how a person listed in the Guinness Book of Galactic Records as having one of the 20 highest QS ever recorded could have been simply gathered up and transported off Terra, like a sack of Carthago potatoes, as one historian put it. Katherine and Davion not only allowed her brother to do this, but subsequently showed herself to be one of the most dynamic women of her generation. There is some dispute as to whether Katherine was emotionally disturbed during her life on Terra. In her late teens, from 2226 to 2228, she was confined to a mental hospital, for 2 reasons. First, the continuous fighting between the liberals and the expansionists made family members of military men like Robert Davion frequent targets of terrorist assassination attempts. Yet Katherine also did and said things that set her apart from others, both children and adults. When Katherine was 8, a neighbor discovered her talking to her dolls in the sort of gibberish that some children make up as languages of their own. It later came out that she had found some textbooks around the house, and was talking to the dolls in poorly pronounced, but grammatically correct, Portuguese, Pali, Polish, and Platt Deutsch. A linguist friend of the family, fearful of unrest in his neighborhood, had begun transferring his library to the Davion home, and Katherine had happened upon a stack of books in the languages. The neighbor knew nothing of this, however, and scolded the little girl, saying that she must never make up something and then insist that it was real. Incidents like these eventually led to Katherine's stay in a mental hospital. moving to New Avalon was a chance to start a new life. There, no one would know of either her eccentricities or her medical record, and so Katherine jumped at the chance to leave with her ear brother. Once settled on the new world, Katherine founded Child's Play to complete her grade at the newly established Outworlds University, now New Avalon University, and soon thereafter married Dr. Morton Candias. Together, they did groundbreaking work on the social dynamics of mental illness. No symptomatic behavior ever occurred in Katherine and Davion. From Unsung Heroines, Women Who Made a Difference, by Leslie Karen Grace, Pankhurst Press, 2871. A Woman of Influence. In 2237, Katherine and Davion left the Outworlds University to enter politics. As an Avalon City Alderwoman, she was responsible for drafting a unique city charter, which remained in effect up until the time of the Reunification War. It called for a peculiar form of profit-sharing among residents of the city. If the citizens have to pay taxes for city services, she argued, it is only fair that they should get something back if there is a surplus. Avalon City grew by leaps and bounds and soon became the largest and most cosmopolitan city in the colony worlds. This is one of the reasons why New Avalon became the capital of the Federated Suns. To exploit mineral resources in the hills outside Avalon City, Katherine and Davion negotiated contracts with the companies that owned the mineral rights, assuring the best possible deal for the industry workers that lived in the city. During an inspection tour of a new mine in the spring of 2242, she was killed in a suspicious cave-in. No evidence of foul play was ever found, but the owners of the mines were known to have opposed certain provisions of Katherine's contracts. She died at the age of 34. Though Katherine Davion had barely begun her work, she influenced the course of Davion history more than some other leaders who lived twice as long. From Unsung Heroines, Women Who Made a Difference, by Leslie Karen Grace, Pankhurst Press, 2871.